Hello, my name is Dr. Kwasu Tembo. I'm a full-time lecturer at Lancaster University in the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing. I'd like to speak to you today about Ousmane Sembene's seminal African film, Xala. In it, Sembene puts forward very interesting ideas concerning colonial regimes, their ostensible passing, and the injunctions of leadership and the critique thereof that are placed squarely at the feet of post-colonial enterprises and their leaders. It's interesting to see how Sembene frames the relationship and the tensions that exist between finance, between African socialism, between ideas of brotherhood and unity, as well as the tensions that exist between Western ideals and values versus traditional ones, and how it is that the principal character of this piece, El Hadji, a Senegalese businessman, represents in a variety of different respects the failures, the premonitions, and the current experience of a post-colonial Africa, its regimes, its issues and debates dispersed along a quartet of commons: politics, economics, culture, and ecology. So before we begin our close analysis of Xala, it would be important and incumbent upon us, I think, to have a variety of different lodestars that we will be bringing to bear in our exploration of this particular text. A synopsis will help in this regard. Xala is a Wolof word which means or refers to temporary sexual impotence. It functions as the title and the symbolic framework through which Ousmane Sembene conducts an adaptation of his 1973 novel in this 1975 adaptation of the same. And in this particular narrative, we find Sembene offering a satirical reprise of a variety of different ways in which leadership fails, both in its pre-colonial and post-colonial respects. We have at the center of this particular narrative El Hadji, a Senegalese businessman who's cursed with erectile dysfunction on the day of his marriage to his third wife, Ngone. And through this motif of erectile dysfunction, Sembene satirizes corruption in African post-independence governments, whereby El Hadji's impotence is a satirical metaphor for the failure of such governments, for their business acumen, and their sense of an ostensibly well-gazetted and widely bugled post-colonial unity. So I think to help orient some of the analytical lines of flight that are opened up by this précis and this overarching metaphor, we can focus and hang it all on a variety of different scenes that play out in the film. But before we do so, I think it would be incumbent upon us to have in our pockets some ideas of satire, whether Juvenalian or Horatian, and some admixture of the two find themselves played out along this quintet of lodestars through which satire typically functions and expresses itself. But there's some 5 fundamentals of satire that I think are helpful in assisting us to think of the way in which Sembene conducts his own satire. We have in satire typically some sense of attack or aggression. There ostensibly seems to be a target of satire that in and of itself finds itself under the duress, under the critical insight, and under the critical lens and scope of an aggressor, or a perspective that seeks to, as the second point indicates, judge, weigh, and value its idea, its socio-political, cultural, and sometimes ecological standing within the commons of that particular culture on a global stage. There is a sense of play and witticism brought to bear in this aggregation of targeting and judgment. Usually language games, double and triple entendre, are brought to bear insofar as presenting a paleisome of ways of interpreting this object of satire, how it is that compound meanings, auto-antonyms can be used or deployed as strategic, formal, and linguistic ways of bringing to bear judgments and attacks or aggressions toward the object of satire. Typically in satire, we find humor expressed, that there's a lot of laughter as a vehicle of, in so many ways, shoehorning or smuggling in something quite incisive and critical about the object of satire in such a way that is not necessarily ostensibly repulsive or overly serious in terms of the satire itself. So humor is used in some respects to launder issues and debates, and sentiments of aggression and judgment. A play of witticisms is also used to smuggle in, I suppose, a more didactic or more perspicacious analysis that in and of itself could be quite critically inflected. And what that really means is the fifth point, that more often than not in satires, you find that there's a desire in humor and play of witticisms and judgment and aggression, the desire to instigate reform. And in this way, that there is some kind of reformist, progressive, maybe even revisionary intent that is latent within a lot of satire. And I think that Ousmane Sembene's particular piece definitely falls within these parameters in a variety of different and unique and interesting ways. And the ways in which these play themselves out can be arranged in this octet of scenes. We have the opening scene with the post-colonial meeting of the new post-independence government and how it is that the discourses and the symbolism that Ousmane Sembene brings to bear in the scene brings into view this question that I started this presentation off. Is Sembene saying that the fetters, the symbols, the recursive reference of a Western imaginary in a post-colonial regime somehow passed or eschewed? Or is he more dubious and perhaps more pessimistic about whether or not the post in post-colonial is even post at all? We have the issues and debates between Haji and Rama, his daughter, which also represent this tension between traditional values and Western ideals. We also have the conflict between Al-Haji's two standing wives, Aja and Umi. And it's really interesting to see how they are figured and presented as representations of old and new ideas in a post-colonial regime and milieu concerning authority, gender, considering religion, considering praxis in terms of cultural spaces. Then the wedding scene in and of itself, in a variety of different places in different ways, all of which can't be covered within the space of this presentation, but I leave the time markers for your own edification as and if you should find yourself watching Xala on your own. The wedding scene in and of itself brings to bear a variety of issues and debates concerning power, money in particular, and the ways in which different strata of a socioeconomic kind, in terms of Black individuals, seeing and misjudging, misapprehending, and in so many ways denigrating their own countrymen and women based on socioeconomic lines. So it's interesting to note how the opening scene satirizes how seemingly easy the process of decolonizing Africa is. It's seemingly just a matter of removal of colonial symbols and iconography associated with the colonial era and its practices. And in this scene, we see a jackboot, we see a marble bust of a war goddess, and this might be some figurization of Britannia, a symbol of British imperialism and sea power, typically depicted helmeted like the Greek and Roman goddesses Athena and Minerva, respectively. But in this instance, carrying a shield embossed with the Union Jack and also wielding a trident, again, as a reference to this maritime puissance. There's also the tricolore, which is employed as a motif in a variety of flags of many former colonial powers, including Germany, France, Italy, Belgium, and the Netherlands. And we note in this particular scene the very solemn and serious voiceover narration about independence, about sovereignty, about very progressive ideas ostensibly concerning brotherhood and unity, which are juxtaposed against the very humorous gang of leaders that we see in frame, who look like my uncles, who are seen shooing away these mustachioed white politicians out of the Chamber of Commerce. And it's interesting and important to note how these issues and debates of independence don't take place in Parliament or in the Supreme or High Court. No, they take place in the central location of true power, namely the Chamber of Commerce. And it's interesting to note how the independence government officials and ministers make the outgoing colonials take the symbols out themselves. And yet outside, it is a white commander who still has authority enough to dispatch and deploy troops. So Sembene is really putting in frame where it is that true power lies, both in a pre- and post-colonial milieu. Is it with the people? Is it with this idea of unity? Is it this idea of African socialism, African identity, cultural values that were somehow denigrated, washed out, whitened, lightened, or completely annulled in and through a colonial regime? Or is it in power associated with fiscal endowment, with money? It's interesting to notice the difference in attire between the local and foreign officials, the whites and the blacks, and how the latter switch from traditional to black tie formal, adopting Western symbols of dress, perhaps with the associative connotation of sophistication and globality, as if to suggest that African traditions are in some way denigrated to the past, including the stylistics of sartorial choices that they might take on. And the satire here, through the juxtaposition and irony that Sembene presents, is really interesting because, on the one hand, the narrator calls for true socialism, African socialism, while these foreign white bankers deliver briefcases full of money for each and every one of this new government and its constituent members, all of the ministers, the deputies, and the honorable collègue. So, what Sembene is showing here is that it's funny and also tragic in equal measure, how the revolution is discussed and debated in the Chamber of Commerce. A satirical suggestion here is that the father, the true father of the free nation, is still and always was, and potentially always will be, money. So despite the suggestion from Mr. President that modernity must not let us lose our Africanicity, this seems to be scene dressing, it seems to be lip service, but not necessarily embodied or really heartfelt or heavily carried forward idea. It's interesting to note how they literally have a red carpet rolled out for them after the so-called revolutionary meeting. Each minister has his own Mercedes-Benz, and it's interesting to note how one of them stalls when trying to pull off. Whether this is intentional or by accident, still acts as an interesting satirical gesture of impotence. All of this pageantry is really satirically inflected and presented as a commentary on the farce of opulence, the ministerial excesses and over-extravagances of what's supposed to be a socialist, unitary, egalitarian, post-colonial society. The same with Ngone's mother is true. The wedding gifts that she receives is an example of excess and opulence. Quote, a gold box or box of gold, a car and a television. We also think about the hierarchy of the wives, of Aja having to go to the wedding ceremony of the third wife. We think about how Umi, the second wife, refers to Aja as, quote, a dried old fish and a harpy, and vociferously, that means passionately and loudly, criticizes her for jealousy due to being older than she is. So hierarchy again, which is in some way carried over or perhaps even entailed in certain cultural practices that ostensibly seem to be the goal of a post-colonial regime that somehow still repeat, maybe in different ways and in different inflections, but still repeat in essence hierarchization in some form. Al-Haji slapping Rama is a very interesting scene. The father slapping the daughter being herself a Marxist, a self-claimed Marxist, and to be gesturing towards beyond some kind of social milieu that's marked by being beyond the ostensible hierarchies, specifically gender hierarchies, of a preceding non-colonial culture. So she slapped for accusing Al-Hajj, her father, of being dishonest because of him being a polygamist. And he says to her in response, quote, take your revolution elsewhere. I am master here. It was people like me that kicked out the colonizers. Polygamy is part of our religious identity. Of course, what Sembene is showing here is that the irony in the tension between Western values and standards of morality and traditional continental practices, that there is potentially an incompossibility, an incompatibility between traditional beliefs and progressive Western values. And of course, the characterization takes place through satiric irony and conflict as well. We think here of how Umi is introduced. She is introduced in conflict with Aja. Aja wears traditional clothing. She's very sedate, relaxed. She's graceful. She's firm in a defensive sense, but calm. Umi, however, is younger, truculent, excitable, passionate, firm in a very combative way. She often yells at El Haji. She directs her demands to him in a vociferous, adroit manner. She insults Aja, while Aja does not engage in insults. And so the two represent different inflections of what it is that they believe a post-colonial nation should be, both for women and for the broader populace more generally. Should it be Western facing in terms of a desire for wealth, for consumption, for the market, the free market, or should it be more predicated on reserve, on tradition, on a maintenance of pre-colonial cultural practices and hierarchies? We think of the scene where Al-Haji tosses coins to the poor gathered outside of the wedding. It's a satire here on the so-called brotherly love and charity promised in a post-colonial Africa. In the scene, Sumbeni is asking, where is the African unity here? Al-Haji might as well be some sort of colonialist throwing scraps of food to slaves. This scene also emphasizes this kind of dog-eat-dog nature of the milieu, as the soldier is the one who claims the coins that Al-Haji tosses. He uses his stature and authority to secure the coin for himself, with the authority of and potential promise of violence to secure these post-colonial resources. Where is the idea of a free, decolonized, unified sense of community here? The irony of Umi saying to Ngone's mother that we women must stick together is really interesting after spending much of her introductory scene bad-mouthing Aja, whom in this scene she refers to as her elder and example. Aja only complains about being demoted in the order of wives, a point on which she refuses to budge. When it comes to her wealth, and with her wealth transferred to El-Haji, her status as first wife protects her financially. So how is it that culture reinstituted and revivified in a post-colonial milieu can offer certain lines of power, lines of flight, and enfranchisement to people who, under a colonial regime, were denuded of those accesses and resources? So the irony here of Umi saying, you'll see I'm not jealous, after going off about Aja, who in and of herself is a representation of these very structures I just mentioned. So Aja telling Umi to be patient like her wife, patience doesn't kill. If it did, I would be dead, really calls into view the patience of a colonially subjected peoples. Is there some kind of reservoir of intensity of reserve or potential to contravene this sense of loss that must be endured as a part and subject to a colonial regime that in and of itself will be paid in subsequent dividends in a post-colonial milieu? It's an interesting question, much to and including as well how Al-Haji refuses to remove his tuxedo to wear his traditional kaftan and adhere to tradition by straddling the pestle and mourner, a pre-conjugal ritual. His refusal is ironic here, as he's the one who also yells at his own daughter for being non-traditional with regard to her attitude about polygamy. Ngone's mother retorts in a very ironic way, you're not a white man, you're nothing special, satirizing the convenience, the self-interested reference and enforcement of tradition when it suits Al-Haji. The wedding guests are very interesting, and these 2 points are upon which I'll conclude. The wedding guests say, and I should add that the wedding guests are comprised of a variety of different individuals representing different socioeconomic brackets. Now, these wedding guests say things like, quote, I can't go to Spain anymore. Everywhere you look, there are Negroes. They're Black themselves, as if to suggest that it's a differentiation not of race, but of class that is what determines the hierarchies of power in any regime, colonial or post-colonial alike. It's this satire of the outward show and rhetoric of unity and community versus the hyper-individualistic desire for personal gain, status, and uniqueness, the market and capitalist precepts. The president and government minister and Al-Haji discussing sexual performance enhancers before the nuptial night of Al-Haji is a very interesting scene. And it is upon this scene that I'll conclude my own analysis here. Why is it interesting? Well, it's interesting because Al-Haji refuses the president's tincture, who claims that it has a period of onset of 5 minutes. The minister from Banjul claims his is instant. Al-Haji only agrees to accept both their tinctures, ironically, to satisfy them. not the intended recipient of their effects, namely his wife. And so we find ourselves concluding on this specific idea. Is Usman Sembeni saying that ultimately post-colonial regimes should be held to account, specifically in terms of their leadership structures and leaders themselves, as to who it is that they intend to serve, to whom it is that they intend to return and reimburse with a variety of different forms of access to resources that were denied them under the auspices and the tyranny of colonial regimes? It's a very interesting question that Xala, in a variety of different ways, symbolic and narrative alike, addresses and puts forward. I highly enjoin you to watch the film yourself and to consider the distance between history, the present, and premonitions of times and futures to come. Thank you very much.